What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. The Pokemon world is full of strange details that you might not expect. I mean, just take a look at pretty much any Pokedex entry if you're not sure, but there are certain obscure and bizarre facts about the universe or the games themselves that many players might not know. So let's look through a few and see how many caught you off guard. So let's start with an easy one. In Fire Red and Leaf Green, the coding in the game was glitched with the move Roar. It would work normally fine, but if a roaming Pokemon used it, instead of simply ending the battle, it would accidentally delete the Pokemon from the game forever. As you might have realized, the only Pokemon that roam would be legendaries, and the Johto beasts happen to have the move Roar. Now, there are ways to get around this glitch, but if you're unprepared for it, then you just lost the chance to catch the beast for the entire save file. If you want to try again, you'll have to delete everything and start from scratch. But you might have known that already, like the fact that no Pokemon has ever gained the normal type when it evolves. If a second stage has the normal type, you best believe that the previous stage had it too. And the same holds true for Bug, actually. No Pokemon ever becomes more insect-like when evolving. However, the opposite is true for both of these. Pokemon lose Normal and Bug all the time. So I guess those types are just too plain to ever be added onto a Pokemon past their introduction. But speaking of Bug types, we all know Vivillon and its many color patterns, right? There are almost an excessive amount of patterns for this creature to take on depending on its real-world locations, with only a couple being event-based. However, instead of always getting the same pattern whenever you evolve it, your Vivillon remembers the place of its origin and will maintain its pattern from where it was captured. But technically, according to the game's code, there are just as many forms of Scatterbug and Spupa. The only difference is that none of those forms actually have any definable features. A river Spupa looks just the same as a tundra one or an archipelago version. I guess this was just the easiest way to keep track of this information in the game's data, but this also means that these early Kalos bugs by default have the worst possible alternate forms ever in the Pokemon series. However, this isn't the only location-based Pokemon quirk. Back on the Game Boy, if you took a Pokemon onto your team back to explore the spot where you captured it, the Pokemon's happiness will increase much faster than anywhere else. Well, I said the Game Boy, this is really only true for Crystal version, which is odd that they would introduce it in the middle of a generation. It may have been ahead of its time like the moving sprites, but this feature never returned past this one entry. But that's a huge shame. It makes sense that if you took a Pokemon back to their home environment, that they would be happier, running around their old stomping grounds, showing you all the things they used to do, and maybe even coming across some of their old friends. Happiness doesn't really always matter in the games, but I think a feature like this is pretty ingenious and should absolutely come back. But while we're talking about Crystal, I think it's worth noting Phanpy. After this game, the long-nosed Pokemon forever lost access to the move Water Gun, which it could learn here. Now you might say, that makes sense, why would a pure ground type need a move that it's weak to anyway? Well, that might be so, but as much as Pokemon gain random coverage all the time, this one doesn't seem random. As a small elephant, Phanpy is more than able to suck up some water and spray it out, so Water Gun actually fits this Pokemon. It's not like it's Hydro Cannon or something overpowered, so maybe it doesn't matter to get this as an egg move anymore, but little touches like this are what made the Pokemon world feel so tangible in the first place. Another one that people probably know is if you were somehow to combine all the types together, the mixture of all 18 would result in only one weakness to the rock type. This is truly impressive because it would have all of the immunities piled on together, but since nothing is immune to rock, you can look at the offensive makeup and see that there are 3 types that resist it, but 4 types that are weak to it, so rock barely comes out ahead. It would have been an overall quad weakness before the steel type was introduced, but then that would also throw off everything else about the combination anyway, so we'll move on. But while we are considering types, Johto comes up yet again on the list when we look at the gym leaders. Aside from them being fairly mishandled by not utilizing most of the new Pokemon that they should have, Bugsy also stands out as ruining a different pattern in not having an advantage over the next gym. See, Faulkner being a flying specialist could easily obliterate the Azalea leader's bug types, and post-Bugsy we could see that Whitney's normal types would be immune to Morty's ghosts and be able to take them out with coverage. Morty is then likewise immune to Chuck's fighting types in his gym, who are then super effective against Jasmine's steel types in the next gym, and then Steel beats Price in the Mahogany gym, and of course Ice beats Dragon at the end in Blackthorn. It's crazy that I never noticed this before, but maybe that's because Bugsy grinds the whole thing to a halt, since Bug has no real advantage over normal. I guess they didn't have much of a choice since they had to cover all of those missing Kanto types as soon as possible, but it is a bit annoying to have this pattern over before it even starts. So the new Pokemon Diplin is pretty odd, not inherently so, but when combined with its own new evolution Hydrapple, it creates some abnormalities. First of all, this is the first set of Pokemon ever to be direct relatives, that is one evolving into the other, introduced in the same generation that are not next to each other in the National Dex. Not that the National Dex means much these days anyway, but even in the regional dexes they're not next to each other, because Diplin didn't even appear in the Blueberry Academy, and of course Hydrapple didn't even exist in Kitakami. The closest we've ever gotten to this was Badoo and Roserade, but at least they were next to each other, so clearly dividing them between the two halves of the DLC put some strain on their relationship. Also, this setup makes Diplin the only Pokemon to evolve by being exposed to an item that can evolve further. Not any item-based evolution like trades, because there is still Porygon 2 that can evolve more, but as for just going into your bag and instantly evolving a Pokemon with an item, no stone-evolved Pokemon can grow any further, leaving Diplin in a class all its own. However, this is not the only eccentricity with item-based grass evolutions, because we also have Ivysaur. We've all known this seed bearer for decades, but did you know that it is still, to this day, the only evolved grass and poison type that doesn't evolve again with an item? Meaning, in a 3-stage line, every grass and poison type uses some kind of stone to evolve, and ones that don't, like Amoonguss, can't evolve into anything anyway. So this makes Ivysaur even more special, on top of taking up a surprisingly implausible spot in the Smash Bros. Roster. And grass continues its reign on the list. Prior to Generation 9, every single grass-type Pokemon could learn the move Sunny Day, except for one. You would expect creatures that use photosynthesis to be able to interact with the sun, so which plants can't do this? Well, the Snover line could not learn Sunny Day, and now it all clicks. These Ice-type trees have Snow Warning as their ability, which conjures up hail, so it would directly interfere with their main gimmick to call up the sun. Not to mention that it would drastically enhance their own fire weakness, but for some reason multiple Gen 9 grass types have suddenly decided to follow Abomasnow's lead, so let me know how you would justify those down in the comments, because I'm stumped. Now, I know that Megas went away for a few years there, however they are gaining relevance again, so it is worth asking the question, which is the one Mega Pokemon not in any Gen 6 regional dex? Considering the first 3DS generation is the one that introduced the feature, you would think that they would have them all covered somewhere, but as it turns out, Lopunny does not appear in either the Kalos Dex nor the Hoenn Dex. Although when you think about it, Lopunny's Mega didn't debut until Oros, and they pretty much had the same regional dex as the originals, which predates Lopunny, but then I suppose the question would be why didn't they think to implement it earlier in X and Y, or, you know, have the Baniri line in those games at all. But since we're on Kalos, a funny thing happens in the game to ensure that you can't just ignore the box art legendary. Starting in Black and White, they made you capture your version's dragon in order to progress the story. But a crazy situation can arise where if you fill out every possible box and have no room left, you would have to defeat Zekrom or Reshiram instead to be able to move on, only to catch it later. So in X and Y, they decided, with the same mandatory encounter in place, that they would avoid the unlikely scenario again by keeping a PC box in reserve that only opens up once you capture the required Pokémon. Actually, the same thing happens in the Hoenn Gen 6 games too for catching Rayquaza in the Delta episode, which is good because you do not want to miss out on that Deoxys that comes right after. And the same thing happens again in Sword and Shield when the big story beat of catching Eternatus happens. Not sure why the odd number generations aren't jumping onto this as well, but if you're going to force players into specific captures, ensuring that they can actually do so with a secret box makes things a lot less tedious. Maybe this one doesn't actually count because it's based on the Pokedex, which is full of made-up nonsense, but it is stated that Doduo can run up to 60 miles per hour, which is pretty speedy in real life and more than warrants the fast reputation that these flightless birds have. However, similar Pokedex entries also state that its evolution Dodrio's top speed is around 40 miles per hour. This could make sense logically, I suppose, with it being even bigger and having an extra head to lug around as well, but Dodrio's speed stat also increases pretty significantly when it evolves, so this is a pretty huge inconsistency. I guess in a race you would be better off hitting the B button, but then again the Dex is also wrong about how Doduo sleeps, so I guess any of this could be wrong. Something truly random that I have no idea why it changed is with Chespin. I don't know why, but my favorite Kalos starter, for some reason, lost the ability to learn the move Tackle in Generation 7. This is the first move that Chespin will know, like pretty much any Pokemon out there, but after that they just totally dropped it in favor of going straight to Vine Whip. And for some reason this has stayed the case all the way to the Indigo Disc, even though its counterparts still proudly have their boring normal attacks with identical stat spreads. So why is Chespin the only starter to begin life exclusively with a stab attack? However, I did want to touch on these attacks, because have you noticed a pattern emerging with the starters? Early on they didn't really have a set theming, but starting in Sinnoh, they seemed to intentionally make it so that one starter had the move Tackle, another had the move Pound, and the last one could use Scratch. As I said, all of these function exactly the same, but it's interesting that they decided each starter was unique enough to warrant its own special way of neutrally damaging targets. Now, Unova did skip this trend, giving all of them Tackle, maybe because they thought it was a reboot and that would be somehow too confusing otherwise, but ever since then you can be sure that one starter will have the traditional Tackle, but another, probably slender one with claws, will use Scratch, and then the last one will have Pound and is somehow always a water type. So when trying to predict Pokemon starters for future generations, this might just be the most accurate indicator that you could try out. But one last tidbit on the starters. Everybody loved the Kanto starters back in the day, and they are still some of the most popular and recognizable Pokemon in the world. So it would be pretty hard to top them, which I guess is why they didn't even try the next time around. See, if you look at their stats, you would be excused for thinking that you're seeing double, since all of the types share the exact same base stat totals. But it's deeper than that, because the water types, Blastoise and Feraligatr, have identical defense and speed, which is pretty odd because you would think that a turtle would go to the extremes on either end of those categories, and the rest may be shuffled around, but they are all the numbers 79, 83, 85, and 105. However, the grass types, Venusaur and Meganium, have the opposite, sharing the same spread across the board, only swapping their two defense and special attack stats, which may be part of why Meganium seems so much worse, I don't know. But then with Fire, literally every single stat between Charizard and Typhlosion is identical. How did I never realize that these back-to-back starters shared the same HP, attack, speed, everything? These Pokemon effectively fill the same roles on any team that you might need. Except for the flying type, I guess, but if you really want to make them stand apart, the Hisuian version does in fact have altered stats, so it only took about 20 years for Typhlosion to become its own Pokemon, because unfortunately, if you want to get technical, I guess the Eruption Pokemon counted as yet another form of Charizard. As if we didn't have enough of those running around already. So those are just a few obscure Pokemon facts that may not be totally obvious to everyone. But there are of course many more ways for Pokemon to surprise us, so leave your favorite random wacky Pokemon information down in the comments. Also be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And until next time, stay grounded.